Number 3. A new trauma theory. Christine and I met when I first started sharing my healing journey on social media. Christine, like Ally, responded to my posts about self-betrayal, or the consistent denial of our real wants and needs, which leads to destructive or self-harming behaviors. Christine easily admitted to being a self-help junkie. She had tried every wellness trend there was. She'd go out and buy the books, then she'd go to the library, seminars, even week-long courses in exotic locations throughout the world. Always lead to the same result, disillusionment. No matter what she did, she always ended up back where she started. She would immerse herself completely in a practice or experience at first, only to find herself wandering after a few weeks. Bored, uncomfortable, I'm done with it. Her number 1 issue, she informed me, appeared to be superficial, but it haunted her. She despised her tummy chub, as she referred to it, had tormented her since adolescence. Despite the fact that she had never been overweight, she had a persistent feeling that her stomach was gross, as if it were an alien part of her body that didn't belong. When she began to investigate her nutrition, she noticed that she frequently forgot what she ate in a day. Even as the food entered her mouth, she would sometimes forget she was eating. She described nights when she zonked out while eating a pan of brownies. It wasn't until she came up for air that she realized she was so unaware of the food she was eating that she scarcely registered flavor or taste. This is typical of someone in a state of dissociation, which is a coping technique of physical and mental isolation from our environment in reaction to chronic stress or overwhelm. A person is physically present yet mentally absent. It's a defensive reaction to an event or scenario that feels too huge or dangerous for the conscious mind to handle. Dissociation is a common stress response in people who have experienced childhood trauma. The word was coined by psychiatrist Pierre Janet, who described it as a breaking off of the self. To my customers, it's like leaving in a spaceship, a type of metaphysical dissociation of the self from the body. Christine's food dissociation revealed that she was striving to escape anything unrelated to eating. Christine gradually began to open up about her history. She realized her family had not given a trustworthy or supportive atmosphere, and that her mother frequently tormented her and solicited the help of her siblings to pile on. In the absence of safe, secure relationships, she harbored a dreadful secret that tormented her. A close family member, a man in his 40s, had begun sexually abusing her when she was 9 years old. The man had persuaded Christine that what he was doing to her was a secret, and that if she informed anyone, she would be in trouble. A frequent tactic used by sexual predators. The abuse carried on for a long time. Her family even made fun of the man's obvious preference for Christine. Her mother would tell her, "You're his favorite." When he bought her gifts or took her on special outings, her siblings were irritated. "You're such a jerk." Christine had an innate sense that what was going on was wrong, but she learned to dismiss her intuition and believe her perpetrator. She coped by disengaging, mentally withdrawing while her body was subjected to the torture. She eventually discovered that she couldn't trust herself after repeatedly disconnecting from her intuition, instead relying on the views, beliefs, and opinions of others. Her dissociative behavior became her normal coping method, which meant leaving the present moment while she was experiencing unpleasant feelings in adulthood. Witnessing this pattern as an adult helped her better grasp that it was a taught behavior from childhood in which she fled the present moment to emotionally cope. Trauma, a mistaken concept. Trauma, as most mental health professionals define it, is the aftermath of a profoundly traumatic incident, such as severe abuse or neglect. Such incidents have a life-changing impact, dividing a person's world into a before and after, as Christine's sexual abuse did. The Adverse Childhood Experiences, ACEs test, developed by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, is used by mental health professionals to assess the severity of trauma in their clients' experiences. The ACEs questionnaire contains 10 questions that address many sorts of childhood trauma, such as physical, verbal, and sexual abuse, as well as experiences of witnessing such abuse or having a family member who is incarcerated. Each yes response to the 10 questions earns 1 point. According to research, the higher the score, the greater the likelihood of bad life outcomes, ranging from higher rates of substance misuse and suicide to an increased risk of developing chronic illnesses. The ACE's framework is significant because it clearly outlines how childhood traumas leave long-lasting effects on our bodies and minds. The ACE study demonstrates that what occurs to us as children, especially when it is a traumatic experience, sticks with us for the rest of our lives. When I took the ACEs, I received a 1. Almost 70% of persons globally receive at least a 1. That outcome confirmed the message I learned during my training. The term trauma applied solely to people who had suffered extreme abuse, such as Christine. I would never have considered my own childhood to be traumatic in any way. I grew up in what I considered to be a typical family. My father worked hard and came home at the same time every night. We were never without food. My parents were not alcoholics. They had not yet divorced. There was no severe verbal abuse or physical violence. Despite this, I had almost no recollection of my upbringing. The normal defining moments in a person's life, first kiss, prom, holidays, were all blank for me. I too had difficulty with facial recognition. I could never detect a familial connection. Babies, to me, were not mirror images of their parents. They were infants to me. I could never tell the difference between the individual being interviewed and the actor in a reenactment scenario when I saw docudramas. I didn't understand any of this was unique until I shared my blankness with others, who would become upset when I couldn't recall a shared memory, or make fun of me when I couldn't recognize someone from my past who I should have recognized right away. Some people were taken aback. "You've got to be joking. How could you have forgotten?" It became a running gag among my friends. Nicole has the worst memory. I should mention that I remembered emotions. I still had feeling memories or impressions of the past. I just didn't associate those sentiments with specific experiences. I remember lying in bed at 6 years old and going through the possibilities of my world collapsing. My parents could die. Someone could break into the house. We could all perish in a fire. And so on. This anxious condition is a recollection of a sensation memory, and a manifestation of my family's fear-driven theme. It's always something. That something could be an irritated neighbor, an unpaid bill, a snowfall, or a disagreement with another family member. If anything bad happens to one of us, it happens to all of us. We were all caught up in a vicious loop of fury and worry. Unlike the rest of my family, who appeared to be overwhelmed by living in such a frightening situation, I never appeared to be overwhelmed. They referred to me as the aloof one, the laid-back, cold child who was easygoing and went with the flow. It appeared that nothing worried me. That aloofness was a coping tactic, my mind's way of protecting itself from the stress. I'd disconnect, separate myself, and enter my spaceship. I was so disconnected from myself, so far away on that spaceship, that I eventually saved very few memories from my youth and barely any memories from my 20s. Just because my head wasn't paying attention to what was going on around me doesn't mean my body didn't recall. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, trauma expert and author of the seminal book The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma, describes dissociation as a process of simultaneously knowing and not knowing, and claims that traumatized people who disengage remember too little and too much. Trauma lodges itself in the body in a variety of ways, which we shall address in greater detail in the following chapter. And its most significant impact may be on the nervous system's fight or flight stress response, only later in my life. After years of providing therapy to patients like Christine, did I begin to notice commonalities among people who had experienced childhood trauma. Many reacted by establishing isolated spaceships, which led to lifelong habits of disengaging, detaching, and making few memories. This revelation begged the question: if nothing traumatic had ever happened to me, why couldn't I remember most of my childhood? Why was it so difficult for me to connect with and care for myself emotionally? Why did I keep betraying myself? How could Christine and I have had the same trauma reactions when our childhoods were so different? Little did I know at the time that what I was going through was a sort of spiritual trauma, and that I was dealing with the ramifications of that trauma in my daily life. Just like Christine, adding to the definition of trauma, I've treated clients at all levels of the ACE's continuum, from those who grew up in ideal families with trauma scores of 0 to those who had ACE scores close to 10, with more traumatic experiences than many of us could comprehend, let alone survive, despite their disparate histories. The dynamics followed a similar script. Many were functional perfectionists, overachievers, or substance or behavior addicts. There was a lot of worry, despair, lack of confidence, poor self-worth, and a fixation on being perceived in a certain manner. There were several troubling relationship trends, and then there was the stuckness, the inability to break free from ingrained habits of conduct. The patterns were weaving a story, one that would shed light on how common childhood trauma is. The reality is that many people cannot pinpoint multiple, or even one events that shattered their lives. Many people may be unable to admit that any aspect of their childhood was harmful. That's not to say there wasn't trauma present. I've yet to meet someone who hasn't had some amount of trauma in their lives. I believe that our concept of trauma should be expanded to embrace a wide spectrum of overpowering experiences. Or, as neurologist Robert Scare characterized it, any bad life event that occurs in a condition of relative powerlessness, although beneficial. The ACE's framework does not provide the entire tale of trauma. It ignores the gamut of emotional and spiritual traumas that result from repeatedly ignoring or repressing the needs of the genuine self, which so many of us have experienced, surprisingly. The ACE's assessment does not even include the various ways in which the outside environment, really, society at large, can traumatize us. The ACE's exam has no questions about overt racism, such as discrimination and abuse, which are evident kinds of racial trauma, let alone any mention of the subtler, more widespread, and damaging forms of bigotry and bias that exist in society's infrastructure when you live in an unsupportive and downright frightening environment, such as the education system, prison system, healthcare system, and most workplaces. You are in an almost continual state of trauma. Marginalized groups, particularly BIPOC, are facing institutional oppression, discriminatory legislation, and a biased framework that may position them squarely in a state of relative powerlessness. As Scare defines trauma, to put it another way, traumatic experiences aren't always visible. Our interpretation of the trauma is as real as the trauma itself. This is especially true during childhood, when we are most weak and dependent on others. Trauma occurred when we continuously betrayed ourselves for love or were treated in a way that made us feel inadequate or unacceptable, resulting in a shattered connection to our genuine self. Trauma instills in us the fundamental conviction that we must betray our true selves in order to survive. Conditioning in the childhood. The job of a parent figure is to guide. A loving parental relationship gives a safe foundation for a child to return to as they navigate life's ups and downs. A guide is often non-judgmental, allowing the child to be themselves. The guide is more likely to see and act from a position of wisdom and understanding. This allows the child to witness the natural repercussions of their actions without intervention, laying the groundwork for them to develop self-trust. Consider the guide to be a wise instructor, someone who believes in the foundation they've laid and believes the pupil will be able to weather anything life throws at them. This belief is then internalized by the youngster. This does not imply that the child is immune to pain, loss, rage, or grief, the full range of human emotions. Rather, the guide or parent figure has given a foundation of security and resilience for the child to fall back on when times get tough. If parent figures have not healed or even recognized their unresolved traumas, they are unable to actively manage their own life path, let alone act as trustworthy mentors for others. Parent figures are notorious for projecting their own unresolved traumas onto their children. When well-meaning parent figures react under the influence of their own unconscious scars, they may attempt to control, micromanage, or pressure a child to obey their will instead of offering counsel. Some of these efforts may have good intentions. Parent figures may deliberately or unconsciously desire to keep the child safe and protected from the outside world so that the youngster does not experience the same sorrow that they do. They may disregard the child's wants and needs in the process, even when it appears to be purposeful. These reactions are often the result of their own deep-seated grief, which may be hidden beneath the surface. Many of us were raised by parent figures who struggled with their emotions as a result of unresolved childhood sorrow. They may have projected their anguish onto us directly when they told us not to cry, or indirectly when they withdrew in response to our displays of emotion. According to Lindsay Gibson, a psychologist and author of Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, How to Heal from Distant, Rejecting, or Self-Involved Parents, a lack of emotional connection as a kid leaves a gaping hole where true security may have been. The loneliness of feeling unnoticed by others is as fundamental as physical injury. When we perpetuate these behaviors of emotional avoidance, shut down, and shaming into adulthood, we experience emotional loneliness. I suppose it's becoming clearer how trauma is transmitted down through generations, from one parent figure to the next. To us, conditioning, in which thoughts and behaviors are unintentionally imprinted on us, is important to this process. Anyone who has spent time with a young child knows that they mimic others' behaviors. Whether influenced by a buddy, classmate, or cartoon character, youngsters behave as they see. Conditioning operates in this manner. We learn from what others particularly our key parental figures, model for us. Our relationships form the foundation for our subconscious beliefs in our formative years. We learn about relationships by observing people closest to us in them. We learn about our bodies by witnessing how our parents feel about theirs. We decide whether to prioritize self-care or not. We develop spending habits, worldviews, and beliefs about ourselves, others, and the world as we grow up. These beliefs, along with a plethora of other signals, were encoded in our mind. We continuously look to our parental figures for advice and as mirrors. The way they engage with their reality is likely to be how we engage with ours. We inherit their methods of perceiving and behaving, as well as their beliefs, habits, and coping strategies. The work is to carefully observe your loved ones and your attachments to them in the same way that you learn to actively observe yourself. It took me a long time to realize I had unresolved childhood trauma. For a long time, I was reluctant to accept it to myself. If you implied that my childhood was less than wonderful, I would have fought you tooth and nail. This was due to a culturally entrenched safeguarding of the family unit, as well as an idealization of my history. It would have been terribly rude to admit publicly that not everything was perfect. We were a large, happy Italian family. You're crazy to think otherwise. I resisted for years. I had ignored my own reality for so long that shifting my perspective and beginning to understand the past through the prism of childhood wounding would take a lot of effort on my part. I'd ignored my own needs for so long that I'd forgotten about them. Like most of us, I repeated and carried with me many of the habits I learned as a child. Many of us never ask ourselves, is this truly me? How many of us still celebrate holidays in the same way we did as children, without even doing things differently? How many facets of your life did you choose, and how many did you inherit? Identifying your wounds is a crucial step in the healing process, yet it is rarely simple. This reckoning frequently unearths deep reserves of sorrow, despair, and even rage that you have long hidden in order to function and move on, at least on the surface. As you delve deeper into this practice, keep in mind that old wounds from childhood may be open, resulting in an outpouring of feelings. Keep in mind that this, too, might be a witnessing moment. Regardless of what happens, start practicing being kind to yourself and your loved ones. The way a parent figure handled you as a youngster does not represent who you are today, or who they are at all. You are not required to mirror their unprocessed trauma. What follows is a novel paradigm for understanding childhood trauma, complete with archetypes I created based on typical patterns I've witnessed in my lengthy clinical practice as well as within the self-healer community. These are not absolute categories. You may strongly identify with one of the dynamics, or a combination of them. You don't have to fit into a box. I only want to help you consider your major relationships and the training you've received. Awareness is the first step toward recovery. Childhood trauma archetypes. Having a parent who is denial of reality. A common case of reality denial happens when a child expresses his discomfort in the presence of a relative to his mother and receives a response such as, "Oh, she's just trying to be nice. You should be courteous." We saw this to its logical conclusion in Christine and her family's perception of the man abusing her. When a parent figure dismisses a child's reality, the child is unknowingly taught to reject their intuition, their gut feeling. The more we learn to doubt ourselves, the more this intuitive voice withdraws, becoming increasingly difficult to hear. As a result, intuition is gone, and there is internal conflict. We learn that we can't trust our own judgment, and must rely on others to shape our reality. Denying a child's reality can take on many different shapes. A child may confide in their parent figure that their classmates refuse to sit with them at the school lunch table. It was a very distressing circumstance for the youngster at the time, and it caused them to feel rejected at a time when the desire for peer validation is a vital aspect of development. "Don't worry, you'll make new pals," the well-meaning parent figure can answer dismissively. "It's not a major issue. Everything will improve. It's just the first day." Anyone who has unresolved sentiments will be uncomfortable with a child's expression of feelings and may attempt to reject them. The child's experiences may elicit similarly painful prior memories for the parent figure, often unconscious, who tends to push the child to repress or ignore the feelings that arise. The issue is that the child was experiencing valid feelings and seeking comfort and assistance. Instead, they were informed that their pain was insignificant. A youngster learns that their vision of reality and accompanying emotional experiences are untrustworthy through repeated similar encounters. When our parent figures and families disregard objective difficulties, we might deny our childhood realities as well. I previously worked with a client whose father was a recovering alcoholic. despite the fact that he worked and supported the family financially. The minute he walked through the house, he'd crack open a beer and drink until he either became hostile and began yelling or passed out. When my client was old enough to notice and comment on his father's behavior, his mother downplayed his concern and justified her husband's actions as a result of a rough day at work. This denial was modeled by my client's mother, who was reared in a home where the reality of a family member's substance use was rejected. My client began to adopt his mother's perspective on his father's actions over time, telling himself how hard his father worked. It wasn't until he drew back the curtain and saw the rows of empty bottles and nightly drinking that he recognized his father's conduct for what it was. Having a parent who is blind or deafening. Children are meant to be seen, not heard, as the adage goes. It was a sort of slogan that summed up our grandparents' attitude on parenting children. This perspective arose from the realization that the only requirements that children had were basic, such as food and shelter. Scarcity of resources was a reality for many members of these generations, many of whom were in survival mode. These people frequently defined effective parenting as meeting fundamental survival needs with little energy or attention left over for emotional needs. The long-term implications of this survival-based parenting method have been handed along through inherited trauma. The experience of not being seen or heard as a child is one of feeling emotionally distant from a parent figure. This can take the shape of extreme neglect at times, but it is more typically in the form of more subtle encounters. It might take the form of a parent figure who is overwhelmed by their own feelings and distracted by chronic stress. Or it can take the form of a parent figure who is completely emotionally shut down and unable to listen to and support their child's emotional expression. Another variation of this appears to be a parent figure racing from activity to task, absorbed in their own mind, and unable to actually notice their child in front of them. This stops them from developing a deeper emotional connection with their child because the parent figure is simply not there cognitively. It hurts to not be heard. Being ignored is upsetting. It is perplexing to find that in order to be liked, we must conceal our genuine selves. One of the most basic human desires is to be acknowledged. Your mind feels ignored if your childhood notions or ideas are not heard. Your spirit feels lessened if your childhood self-expression is not seen. This lack of recognition can also manifest itself in the form of your future being spoken for or predetermined before your interests and life's path are completely understood. Such experiences make it difficult for us to learn to trust our instincts and pursue our intuition desires. It's crucial for parent figures reading this to remember that youngsters outperform us in their connection to their intuition and fundamental self. As adults, we are prone to being engrossed in our own constant stream of thoughts. Children are still very perceptive, and their world is in flux and still forming. You will learn about yourself and the possibilities that each of us has when we are free to express our real selves by creating a safe and open space for your children to explore. Having a parent who either lives vicariously through your molds and shapes you. This type of parent figure is commonly referred to as a stage parent, someone who is overzealous and encourages their child to become an actress or singer in order to satisfy the parent-owned figure's wants for fame, achievement, or attention. Though this archetype is most typically linked with performance and, unfortunately, with moms, this type of behavior is not limited to the stage. It's easy to demonize stage parents since they're frequently represented as abusive in popular culture. The desire to see a child flourish is frequently motivated by a very natural parental instinct, pride. Unfortunately, when the urge to push a child to succeed stems from an unprocessed experience, pride turns sour. Parent figures who live their lives via their children have a deep-seated, painful feeling that they are a failure or otherwise inadequate, and they frequently project this basic view onto their children. Let's assume a father wanted to be a basketball player, but fractured his leg before making his college team, or a mother wanted to be a doctor, but that road was not available to her, so she became a nurse. As a result, the child may feel oppressive pressure to succeed, and may lose aspects of their genuine self in order to please the parent figure. Ultimately, attempting to build one's own legitimacy through the triumphs of others leads to disillusionment on the part of the parent figure. It also causes animosity on the part of the youngster who sacrificed their own needs in order to meet the unmet wants of another. When an intrinsic need is denied, resentment quickly develops. In adulthood, this loss of self can show in a variety of ways, the most common of which are extreme indecisiveness and procrastination or an obsessive urge to succeed. To clarify, occasionally the stage parent behaves with malice, as in the more vilified Hollywood parent who puts their child on stage for financial gain. but many times the parent genuinely wants a better life for their child. Molding and shaping can take various forms, and it occurs when a parent figure repeatedly transfers their own wishes, needs, or desires onto their child, such as telling their child to avoid specific friends or concentrate on certain classes in school. It can be as subtle as telling a child, "You're going to be a wonderful mother one day." This is frequently an entirely unconscious procedure. Parent figures that engage in this type of activity are most likely unaware that they are engaging in potentially harmful behavior. In fact, many people regard it as an act of love, and for them it often is. On occasion, the effects can be devastating for persons in typically desirable professions. Lawyers and doctors, for example, who struggle to cope with career misalignment, use substances, experience mental health concerns, and, in extreme situations, commit suicide. Having a parent who doesn't demonstrate boundaries. Boundaries define our own constraints in a clear way. Boundaries are immediately understood by children. They respond to them and can clearly establish and follow through on their own boundaries, regardless of how others react to them. Just watch how a toddler practically automatically shakes their head no in response to something they don't like. Some adults, on the other hand, have fewer boundaries and often struggle to keep the ones they do have. Many of us were raised in homes by parent figures who did not fully grasp how to use or maintain their own boundaries, rendering them unable to model acceptable limits for us. In my counseling practice, I frequently heard historical accounts of a parent figure reading a childhood diary. This invasion into private space frequently led in a humiliating encounter for the youngster and, in some cases, punishment based on what was read. As happened to me. As youngsters, we learn through these encounters that loved ones can and do cross boundaries. Children who experience numerous boundary crossings may internalize the concept that such boundary crossings are part of closeness and possibly love, allowing them to participate in future partnerships. A child may do the opposite, being extremely secretive and protective of their personal information. Another example of a boundary violation is when one parent figure complains to a child about the other parent figure. Several of my clients told me that as children, they were told sensitive facts about their parents' relationships, such as infidelity or financial troubles. The parent figure may be seeking emotional solace from their child since they are unable to see that the child is not a peer. In such cases, a youngster may be overwhelmed by these particular facts and have conflicting emotions as a result of hearing harsh words about another cherished parent figure. Having a parent that is excessively concerned about appearance. As we all know, the desire for external validation does not end when we grow up. Instead, we are driven by the need to be loved and admired throughout our lives. In a variety of ways, parent figures may project this demand onto their offspring. It can be evident at times. The parent figure who comments on a child's weight or obsesses over the child always being presentable. The parent figure who is unduly concerned with little matters, such as how a child wears her hair. Children immediately learn that some aspects of their physical appearance are acceptable, while others are not. This sets in motion a lifelong habit of believing that obtaining affection is contingent on one's external looks. This same imprinting occurs when our parent figures are too concerned with their appearance, imitating behaviors such as obsessive eating, intensive grooming, or excessive exercise. It can manifest by labeling particular foods as bad or fattening. It can also take the form of making comments on friends, family, or public figures' bodies or attractiveness. Direct statements to the child are not always necessary because, as we all know, a youngster is a sponge who observes when one's underlying ideas are highly image-centered. This can also be seen on a broader scale when parent figures act differently outside the home versus within the home, teaching the youngster that humans can have pseudo-selves. Family members who are continually squabbling or yelling inside the home yet speak and act kindly or at least nicely in public, preserving persona that are, in fact, masks, are an example of this. Children immediately learn that they must change who they are depending on where they are in order to survive and be loved, exactly as they saw demonstrated. Having a parent who isn't able to control their emotions. Emotional regulation is the process of experiencing an emotion, allowing it to pass through the body, rather than trying to distract oneself with drugs, alcohol, an iPhone, or food, identifying it I am angry right now or I am sad, and breathing through it until it passes. The practice of emotional regulation allows us to stay centered and calm in the face of life's various stresses and return to a physiological baseline. Most of us did not have parent figures who could identify, let alone regulate, our emotions. Instead, They didn't know what to do when they were emotionally flooded or experiencing a slew of intense feelings all at once. Some people may have acted out their overwhelming emotional energy by screaming, slamming doors, throwing things, or storming off. Others' emotions project inward, resulting in withdrawal. This appears to be parents using the silent treatment or icing someone out. Icing behavior occurs when a parent figure withdraws love from a child, usually as a result of feeling emotionally overwhelmed. The parent figure shuts down and shuts out their children because they are unable to control their own feelings about a specific experience. Many self-healers have had similar experiences, and some have identified with the phenomenon of a parent who used the silent treatment as a form of punishment. People in our healing circles have spoken about disengaged parent figures, those who stopped speaking to them, and those who used other family members to reject them. When we have loved ones who go into hibernation, we are modeled an overall lack of emotional regulation rather than managing our feelings. And we frequently do not develop coping skills that allow us to build our own emotional resilience. Managing our traumas. You're a swine. You're a piece of scum. My mother once yelled at me, "You're an embarrassment to the family." That terrible moment was one of my mother's rare outbursts after years of suppressing her emotions. It occurred shortly after my sister's wedding. I was the maid of honor, and I was allowed to bring 3 of my closest college friends to the reception. Katie, one of those close friends, happened to be my secret girlfriend. Nobody, not even our closest friends, knew Katie and I were dating. We weren't ashamed. It was just my first same-sex relationship, and I didn't feel the need to announce it to the world, let alone to a family who never discussed anything deeply. My friends and I started drinking heavily the morning of the reception. I remember sobbing while watching the father-daughter dance, which I'm sure seemed strange to my friends and family because I couldn't care less about wedding traditions. It stung with a deeper sense of loss beneath the surface, knowing that I would never be able to give my father this ritual. There was no way I was ever going to have a traditional wedding. The rest of the night went downhill from there, and the more depressed I became, the more I withdrew into myself. Katie was also inebriated and was irritated by my distant demeanor. I brushed her off every time she tried to dance with me. When she tried to kiss me, I gave her the look that said, "Cut it out." She became enraged and stormed away. A scene ensued, and it was clear to everyone in the wedding hall that there was something romantic going on between us. I was in enough denial to think we got away with it. Nobody brought up Katie that night or the next day. My mother unexpectedly appeared a month or so later, after I returned to Cornell University in upstate New York. She had driven up from Philadelphia with my father that day, and when I answered the door, she flew through it and yelled those painful words. As I tried to get her out of my apartment, she kept yelling. The commotion became so loud that a neighbor came out to see if I needed assistance. I got her out of my apartment and back into the car with my father, who sat with his head down and didn't say anything. I was taken aback because my mother rarely, if ever, displayed this level of emotion, making her outburst unsettling for all of us. My mother acted as if I didn't exist when I returned to my childhood home for summer break months later, as if she could walk right through me because I was invisible. A ghost. If we passed in the hallway, she would walk by with her head up and her gaze fixed on something other than me. My father tolerated my mother's silence while still speaking to me. This was the culmination of my childhood trauma. I felt so undeserving, so unlovable. I didn't even exist. It felt almost euphoric to become the physical manifestation of what I had feared. It was what I had spent my entire life preparing for. It was my spaceship at work. The emotional withdrawal lasted for weeks until one day, out of nowhere, my mother began speaking to me again and pretended as if nothing had happened between us. We never discussed my sexual orientation again, and she accepted my future girlfriends as if she had never behaved in any other way. In fact, we never talked about that encounter again. Her body had ejected all her feelings at once after years of repression, resulting in an outsized, destructive outpouring of emotion. When the dust settled, she seemed as if she couldn't believe she'd had that reaction, that she was capable of such emotional expression. As a young adult, I found myself in the push-pull dynamic of emotional reactivity, an emotional withdrawal in and out of romantic relationships. I frequently chose relationships in which I could remain emotionally detached, removed, and often emotionally unavailable. When my emotional needs and deep desires for connection were not met, I would react by calling or texting too frequently, throwing tantrums, and picking fights. If I finally got the emotional reaction I craved, I'd detach and dissociate. Feeling overwhelmed, I'd become the ghost I learned to be as a child. When the relationship inevitably deteriorated, I blamed them. In retrospect, I was trapped in conditioned patterns that were all coping strategies, or ways to manage and control my inner turmoil. In 1984, two pioneering stress and emotion psychologists, the late UC Berkeley Professor Richard Lazarus and UC San Francisco Professor Susan Folkman, presented a theory of coping that they defined as constantly changing cognitive behavior efforts to manage specific external and internal demands that a person's resources. Coping, in other words, is a learned strategy for coping with the profound unease in the body and mind that stress causes. Adaptive and maladaptive coping strategies were described by Lazarus and Folkman. Adaptive coping refers to actions we take to help us return to feelings of safety, such as confronting a problem or redirecting negative thoughts. The key word here is active. Adaptive coping necessitates effort and a conscious acknowledgement of discomfort. When we are not modeled or taught how to use adaptive coping strategies, it can be more difficult to use them. Maladaptive coping strategies, which we often learn from our parents, provide us with a brief distraction or reprieve from the discomfort, for example, by drinking alcohol at a wedding, as I did, or by avoiding any emotional reaction, as I also did when I dissociated. However, neither of these attempts to alleviate our distress results in a greater disconnect from the authentic self. How we cope with a specific environment has less to do with the environment and more to do with our conditioned stress coping strategies. Assume two people work in the same high-stress, performance-based job. Sonia copes with stress by implementing adaptive coping strategies, such as going to the gym on a regular basis to help channel her stress or calling a best friend for support. Michelle, who is under the same pressures, may turn to substances to help her zone out and escape reality. Though she may feel better in the moment, when she awakens the next morning, she is foggy, unfocused, and unhappy. The stress and shame have now been exacerbated, and the cycle of maladaptive coping has continued. In my clinical work, I've seen a lot of bad coping strategies. Among the most common are people pleaser. When you meet the demand, the stress temporarily disappears. Angry or enraged, you've released the feeling if you can direct it at someone else. Dissociation. During a difficult incident, you leave your body so that you don't feel the trauma in the first place. Sexually, this type of detachment can mean having sex with individuals we aren't actually interested in. Instead, it may involve devoting ourselves entirely to our partner's pleasure, with no awareness of or attention paid to our own. All of these coping techniques allow us to avoid repeating or reliving our prior traumas, so delaying the onset of immediate pain. They do not assist us in fully satisfying our bodily, emotional, and spiritual desires and requirements. When our needs are unfulfilled on a regular basis, our grief and detachment are exacerbated. Self-preservation leads to betrayal of oneself. It's a trap that we can easily fall into. The loop of unresolved trauma, recurrence of maladaptive coping practices, and constant denial of self allows suffering to live on in our minds and bodies, finally making us sick. The possibility of change. We are all survivors of unresolved trauma. As we've seen, it's not so much the severity of the incident as it is our reaction to it that decides the impact it has. Resilience is learnt through conditioning. If we did not witness our parent figures model it when we were young, we may not have learned it. We can become more resilient when we work on addressing trauma. In reality, these encounters can serve as catalysts for deep change. When I share information regarding trauma with my online self-healers community, I get a lot of questions like, are you suggesting everyone is traumatized? Or how can I avoid traumatizing my children? Here's the deal. Trauma is a normal part of life. It can't be avoided. Your very first experience on this planet, birth, was likely traumatic for both you and your mother. Just because we've been through trauma doesn't imply we're doomed to a life of misery and illness. We don't have to keep repeating the patterns that shaped our childhoods. We can change if we put in the effort. We can now proceed. We are capable of healing. Trauma is both universal and personal, influencing each person's neurological system, immunological response, and every aspect of their physiology in a unique way. Knowing what you're dealing with, identifying the unresolved trauma, is the first step toward healing in mind and body. The next step is to comprehend the long-term consequences of this trauma, as well as how your acquired coping techniques are keeping you locked. Get to work. Determine your childhood wounds. Take some time to contemplate and write using the suggestions below to become aware of your own childhood traumas or buried emotions. You should only respond to experiences that ring true for you. Many people with unresolved trauma, including myself, don't have many memories, making it difficult to answer some of these questions. Investigate whatever comes to mind. Having a parent who denies your existence is a difficult situation. Remember a time in your youth when you went to your parent figures with an idea, sentiment, or experience and they dismissed it. For example, they may have said something like, "It didn't happen that way, it's not a big concern," or "You should just forget about it." Spend some time connecting with your child self and analyzing what you might have felt when your parent figures reacted in such ways. Feel free to use the following journal prompt to help you reflect. When my parent figures were absent, I felt a parent who doesn't see or hear you. Remember a time when you wanted to be noticed by your parent figures, but they appeared distracted, busy, or otherwise made you feel unacknowledged. Spend some time reflecting on the situations that led you to feel ignored or unheard in the past. Then think about and write about how you may have tried to grab their attention. Did you act out, perform, or withdraw? Feel free to use the following journal prompt to help you reflect. When my parent figures were absent, I felt. To deal with that, having a parent who vicariously lives through you or molds and shapes you. Do you recall a period when you received messages about who you were or weren't as a child? Did you have a parent figure who told you, "You're so sensitive like your mother," or "You need straight A's to make the family proud"? Were you as passionate and committed to those goals as they were? Or did you feel like you were just going through the motions to please them? Spend some time noting the various messages you may have received about yourself as a youngster, as well as the various ways your parent explicitly figures or indirectly communicated wishes may have influenced you. Feel free to use the following journal prompts to help you reflect. While I was a child, I received the following messages about myself. I was aware that my parent figures desired for me to do the following. A parent who does not execute boundaries. Spend some time reflecting on your early experiences with personal limits and their violations, as well as the various types of limits or lack thereof modeled by your parent figures. Feel free to use the following journal prompts to help you reflect. During your childhood, were you able to say no? Or did your parent figures instruct you on how to act? Did your parent figures create clear boundaries in their relationships in terms of time, energy, and resources? Did your parent figures respect or invade your privacy? Transgressions such as reading a diary, listening to phone calls, or other spying activities are examples of privacy violations. Did your parent figures allow you to have conversations, interactions, and experiences with individuals in your life without interfering? Having a parent that is excessively concerned about appearance. Many of us got both direct and indirect messages about our appearance as children. You should wear your hair down. Your thighs are getting bigger. Do you really think it's a good idea to have seconds? Or you'd look a lot better if you didn't wear clothes like that. A parent figures may have personally commented on various parts of your appearance. Such statements are sometimes directed towards others. Your parent figures may have made comments on other people's appearances, emphasizing some characteristics positively and others negatively. Your parents' attention to or rituals surrounding their own physical appearance reflected attitudes and values about what is and is not acceptable. Feel free to use the following journal prompt to help you reflect. What were the messages you received about your appearance? A parent who can't control their emotions. How you control and process your emotions is one of the most crucial parts of your emotional wellness. In childhood, you learn emotional regulation by observing how your parent figures express or do not express their feelings and how they behave when you express yours. Spend some time focusing on how your emotions were managed as a child. Feel free to use the following journal prompts to help you reflect. How did your parent figures react when you expressed strong emotions, such as rage or sadness? Did they, for example, slam doors, vent, yell, or give the silent treatment? Did your parent figures use a particular coping strategy? For example, did they splurge when shopping, utilize narcotics, or completely shun certain or all emotions? How did your parent figures communicate with you or people around you while they were experiencing powerful emotions? Did they, for example, resort to name-calling, accusing, humiliating, or the silent treatment? Did your parent figures take the time to explain or assist you process your own feelings about what happened after you had strong feelings? I heard the following messages regarding feelings in general, and my feelings in particular. As a child, for body trauma, the day I fainted, passed out cold, was the breaking point for me, at least physically. I'd been suffering from dysregulation symptoms for years. When the symptoms grew unbearable, I attempted to solve each problem individually, much like a game of whack-a-mole. My dissociation, I reasoned, was a result of my personality. I have a terrible memory. My nervousness was caused by both my genes and my current situation. I explained to myself. I'm living on my own in New York City. My mother is ill. Therefore, I sought medication from a psychiatrist to help me get through the difficult times. The headaches were also inherited genetically. Working too hard caused the head fog. I had no idea why I was constipated, having noticed a similar pattern in my mother and sister and not bothering to think about it too much. Instead, I drank brewer's yeast, prune juice, and a slew of over-the-counter drugs. It was all individual problems with personalized solutions. Nothing was linked. I traveled from New York City to Philadelphia about that time to pursue postdoctoral psychodynamic work at the Philadelphia School of Psychoanalysis. I saw my family more regularly than I had in years because I was physically closer to them. At the same time, I was seeing my own analyst once or twice a week to supplement my own psychotherapy work and began to pick at the scabs of long-forgotten childhood traumas. Therapy showed me how problematic my family dynamics were, how my family othered anyone outside the family unit and fought so hard to create a facade of harmony and unity to the world while living in a feedback loop of anxiety and terror. I witnessed my mother's difficulty in expressing genuine passion and love, which sprang from the scarcity, not only monetary, but also emotional and spiritual, created by her parent figures, who never exhibited love themselves. I recognized my own defensive mechanisms, disengagement, perfectionism, and numbing, as conditioned trauma responses passed down to me from my mother's own deep-seated anguish. The realizations were harsh and distressing. I didn't have anywhere to store them, so I began looking for mayhem with Lolly, causing fights, pushing her away, and then freaked out when she went. It was the same pattern I'd been repeating for years with my past love partners. A cycle of emotional isolation and the inevitable terror that ensued when the distance became too great. Then I began to pass out. The first time was at my childhood friend Amanda's apartment for a housewarming party. The fact that it occurred at the home of someone connected to my youth is not lost on me. It was a beautiful summer day. She had a pool at her apartment complex that she was excited to show me, and as we went around it, I began to feel uneasy. The sun's rays were hot against the back of my neck. I started to perspire. I instantly felt dizzy, and the sky appeared to swirl. "Okay, Nicole," I recall thinking. "Get your act together." I blinked my eyes open. Lolly and my friend both looked down at me, concerned. "Are you all right?" As Amanda, a certified EMT, checked my cognitive state, Lolly inquired. She noticed me hitting my head hard on the pavement and was frightened that I had sustained a concussion. I protested that I was all right, despite the fact that I was dizzy and slightly sick. The fall did not provide the aha moment it should have. I attributed it to a freak accident. I went back to work as uneasy and disconnected as before. I began to notice more problems with my cognition as time went on. I frequently struggled to find the appropriate words. During one therapy session, I completely lost my train of thought and let the silence linger in the air for several minutes, sincerely apologizing to my client for the lapse. Then I passed out again. Lolly and I spent a lot of time with my family during the Christmas holidays that year. We went shopping for oyster-shucking knives. I recall coming inside the hardware store, disoriented, and thinking about how hot it felt under the intense store lights. I looked up to see a swarm of worried faces. Individuals are forced to live in a near-perpetual trauma state as a result of oppressive environments, producing chronic and never-ending stress responses. It's no surprise that there's a link between oppression and higher incidence of physical sickness and psychological anguish. According to research, BIPOC have greater rates of sadness and anxiety, and they are more prone to acquire hypertension, artery calcifications, lower back discomfort, and cancer. One depressing study followed Black women for 6 years after they completed a survey on the extent of discrimination they faced in their daily lives. Those who reported more events were more likely to acquire breast cancer than those who reported fewer incidents. We are only scratching the surface of our understanding of the vast repercussions of systematic oppression. Fortunately, there is a growing amount of scholarship devoted to studying its consequences. Several works that I believe are necessary reading are listed in the suggested further readings section at the end of the book. Finally, all investigations support this fact: racism, bias, and bigotry infiltrate the body's cells, causing fundamental and damaging changes that are passed down through generations. Racism's consequences can be found in one's blood and bones. Polyvagal theory introduction. As we've seen, unresolved trauma, along with poor coping techniques, has a physiological impact on the body. Stress changes your perception of reality. There is no element of your reality that has not been influenced by stress. The fragrance of freshly cut grass may conjure up memories of a childhood trauma. A stranger's visage may make you feel defensive or terrified for no apparent reason. Hearing a jingle from a sitcom from your youth may make you feel sick to your stomach. Walking down the street or watching the news of daily violence against people who look like you can activate your trauma response if you are a BIPOC in America. Some of you may never feel safe. You may always feel as if the sky is falling. I recognized that I was stressed when I began fainting episodes a few years after moving to Philadelphia. But I was still perplexed as to why I was passing out. There was no tension that I could think of that appeared dangerous enough to cause such a significant reaction in my body. Why was my body hyperactivated despite the fact that there was no immediate threat? Later, when I began researching psychiatrist Dr. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory, which gives novel insights into trauma and the body's stress response, I found why I began to faint seemingly out of nowhere. Polyvagal theory assisted me in understanding how trauma lives in the body and continues to influence our reality. The vagus nerve, which connects the brain and the gut, is referred to as polyvagal. The vagus nerve has several branches of sensory fibers that go throughout the rest of the body, connecting every major organ to the brain, from the brain stem to the heart, lungs, genitals, you name it. The placement and function of these nerves help us understand why the body reacts so quickly when we're stressed, why our hearts race when we run into an X, why terror makes us feel short of breath, and why I began fainting or losing consciousness out of nowhere. When we are in homeostasis, the vagus nerve serves as a neutral brake, keeping us calm and open and allowing us to be our most social selves. When the vagus nerve is stimulated and enters its protective system, fight or flight responses can occur nearly quickly. Participation in social activities. Most of the individuals I see are in a constant state of fight or flight. This stress reaction is an automatic function of the autonomic nervous system, which is the component of the neurological system that controls involuntary actions such as heartbeat, breathing, and digestion. The autonomic nervous system is responsible for allocating our body's resources correctly. It is continually scanning our surroundings for cues. Should I be cautious here? Is this a risky situation? Is this individual a friend or a foe? Is my body hydrated and fed enough to deal with any threats? The autonomic nervous system employs neuroschin, a sixth sense that acts outside of our conscious awareness, to assess our environment and categorize people, places, and things as safe or harmful. When our autonomic nervous system determines that a condition is safe, our vagus nerve instructs our bodies to relax. Our parasympathetic nerve system, sometimes known as the rest and digest system, kicks in at this point. The vagus nerve tells the heart to slow down. Our gut joyfully hums away, delivering nutrients to our body. Our lungs expand and absorb more oxygen. In this tranquil condition, we enter what is known as social engagement mode, in which we are primed to feel comfortable, secure, and capable of readily connecting with people. We appear more engaging and friendlier when we are in social interaction mode. Our smiles appear more genuine. The vagus nerve connects to the muscles of the face and our voices sound more melodious and welcoming. The vagus nerve also connects to the larynx, or voice box. Our hearing improves as the vagus nerve attaches to muscles in the middle ear, which open up and allow us to hear calm human voices better. Our saliva glands are also active, lubricating the wheels of our most powerful tool for engaging with the world around us, our mouth. When we are in this receptive, parasympathetic state, our brain's resources are directed to higher executive processes such as future planning, self-motivation, problem-solving, and emotional regulation. Now that we are no longer preoccupied with survival, we are free to be our true selves. This is a playful, joyful, compassionate, and loving state. This is what I call the learning brain. It is adaptable, open, quiet, serene, and inquisitive, all of which are necessary for reaching milestones in neurological and behavioral development in childhood. We are more prone to make and learn from mistakes. When we fall, we are more inclined to get back up, fight or fly. When we are threatened, our bodies enter activation mode, which is the home of the fight or flight response, which is activated by the sympathetic nervous system, the yin to the parasympathetic nervous system. In activation mode, the vagus nerve delivers SAW signals to the sympathetic nervous system, causing our hearts to beat faster and harder. Stress responses in our adrenal glands to increase cortisol levels, and an increase in body temperature, causing us to sweat. We literally experience the world differently when we are in this heightened condition. Pain is unnoticed. We concentrate on the louder, more upsetting sounds. Our perception of smell loses subtleties, and we look different when we're in activation mode. We get starry-eyed. We furrow our brows. We hunch our shoulders and take a protective stance. Our voices have an artificial, stressed-out tone to them. The middle ear muscles contract, and we instantly register only high and low frequencies, what are known as predator sounds. Everything is filtered through a threat lens. A neutral expression turns hostile. A terrified expression becomes enraged. A friendly expression is suspicious. Our bodies have prepared for battle, an evolutionary requirement passed down from our forefathers. It's a natural adaptive response that we developed when we were constantly threatened by wild animals, starvation, and war. If we are indeed experiencing this level of peril, all of this is beneficial and protective. The same supercharged response occurs with basic, everyday problems in life, such as receiving a text from your supervisor or watching your computer crash when an assignment is due. People who suffer from an excessive sympathetic response system, also known as low vagal tone, describe a slew of problematic concerns. In addition to all of the physical issues linked with this chronic stress state, the following are some of the most typical emotional and relational patterns: insufficiency of emotional resilience, inability to connect meaningfully, concentration problems, difficulty doing higher functioning cognitive activities, such as future planning, problems with postponing gratification. It's worth noting that humans enter fight or flight mode completely unconsciously. Our body's response to a threat is innate and automatic. It is not something we choose. We cannot blame someone who believes they are being assaulted for reacting violently, any more than we can blame someone for overheating while exercising. Immobilization. The two most well-known stress responses, fighting and fleeing, do not represent the entire narrative of the body under attack. As Dr. Porges pointed out in his seminal study on the polyvagal theory in the 1990s, there is also a third mode, immobilization, or freezing. Our vagus nerve has two routes. Social activation and engagement mode are on the same road. This pathway is myelinated, which means it is wrapped in fat to allow it to engage and shut down faster. The second pathway is unmyelinated, making it less reactive, slower to shut down, and more primitive. In reality, we share this pathway not with our ape ancestors, but with reptiles. When the second pathway is triggered, we become immobile. Our entire body shuts down. Our heart rate and metabolism slow to a halt. Our bowels may entirely release or clench and hold. Our respiration may stop. We could pass out. This occurs when our body believes there is no prospect of survival. If you encounter a bear, your mobilization mode may be activated, as your body primes you to either run or flee, writes Justin Sunseri, a polyvagal-informed therapist. However, if the bear is already on top of you, your body may simply give up and seem to be dead. This is dissociation mode. Psychologically, those who enter this phase leave their bodies. Many people, like me, may appear to be present and interacting with others while mentally being far away on their own spaceship. Some people become so detached from the event that they perceive it as a dream. Others suffer from amnesia. Whatever the degree of dissociation, this evolutionarily designed trauma response explains why many of us have so little recall of prior experiences. If we were never genuinely there while events occurred, we have no event memory to return to. It also explains how difficult it is to disengage from this detached state and return to the present moment. Once you've reached this condition, recovering rapidly is quite impossible due to the unmyelinated nerve. This social world, so many of my clients, friends, and members of my online self-healers group have come to me with interpersonal concerns that reflect disconnection. I just can't seem to connect with anyone. I desire friends, but I can't seem to establish any emotional depth. Nobody knows the real me. I'm having trouble finding love. As I dug deeper into the polyvagal literature, I found that the difficulty to create meaningful connection with others is often a result of our vagal tone, a measure of our nervous system's response to our environment. When we have low vagal tone, we are more sensitive to perceived threats in our surroundings, which overactivates the body's stress response and leads to poor emotional and attentional regulation overall. Those of you who suffer from social anxiety may understand this disconnect. Consider entering a gathering full of strangers. You may have worried over what to wear to the party, planned every detail and conceivable conversation topic, or you may have felt completely neutral about the occasion, with no warning signals that you could feel uncomfortable and respond appropriately. In any case, none of this matters once you go into the room. Suddenly, all eyes are on you. When you hear laughter, you know it's over your clothes or your hair, and your face becomes heated and red. Someone brushes by you, and you feel claustrophobic. All of the strangers appear to be leering, even if you know cognitively that this is not a hostile environment, that no one is staring at or judging you. And if they are, who cares? It's very impossible to escape the sense once you're caught in it. That's because your subconscious sees a threat via your nervous system's sixth sense of neuroception in a non-threatening situation. The party and has engaged your body, putting you in a state of fight, argue with everyone, flight, leave the party, or freeze. Don't say anything. The social sphere has devolved into a dangerous environment. Unfortunately, this type of nervous system instability is self-confirmatory. While it is active, anything that does not corroborate your suspicions. A nice face will be ignored by your neuroception in favor of items that do. The stray laugh you felt was directed at you. Social cues that would be perceived as pleasant when you were in social engagement mode, such as a stop in the conversation for you to enter, eye contact, and a smile, would be misconstrued or disregarded. We are social beings. We need to be connected in order to survive. However, neural systems that are dysregulated as a result of unresolved trauma keep us dissatisfied, outside of our emotions, and locked in our incapacity to connect with others. Co-regulation. When we are stuck in a trauma response, our neuroception can become erroneous. It misreads the surroundings, senses risks where none exist, and returns us to an overactive fight or flight response. The activation cycle then begins all over again. Understanding why this happens isn't enough to solve our socioeconomic problems. The problem is that the states of our neurological systems are feedback loops. According to Dr. Porges, we mimic the autonomic state of others around us. When we feel safe, it shows in our eyes, voice, and body language. We are fully present, and our demeanor is light and easy. This sensation of safety is transmitted to others through a mechanism known as coregulation. When others are reassured that you are not a threat, they will also feel comfortable and engage the same social activation mode that makes them feel at peace. Our energies and states can be transferred. We feel better and calmer in the presence of some people because our neurological systems respond to theirs. The bonding hormone oxytocin circulates, assisting us to attach emotionally, in the case of love relationships. Physically, a sense of security produces a comfortable base. It's a two-way street of connection. The ability to co-regulate is formed during childhood. As we've seen, we are conditioned by our parental figures in subtle and significant ways. One of the most essential behaviors we learn from our loved ones is how to use internal coping techniques to return to the safe and creative realm of social mobilization or social engagement during times of stress. If you lived in a house that was filled with calm and healing energy, your system not only internalized but also replicated that environment. When there is a safe environment to return to, our vagal nerve will return us to our parasympathetic state of balance, or homeostasis. If you grew up in a chaotic household where overreaction, wrath spirals, disengagement, or terror were the norm, your internal resources were most likely tied up in stress management, survival, and you couldn't freely return to the safe social engagement mode. Children, as we've seen, are reliant beings. If a parent figure creates a chaotic, stressful environment, the youngster will internalize and generalize that state. My parents are endangered. They are a menace to me since they are unconcerned about my requirements. The world is a dangerous place. This survival brain, as opposed to the learning brain, is hyper-focused on perceived threats, thinks in hard and fast black and white, and is frequently circular, obsessive, and panic-driven. We are terrified of making mistakes. When we fail, we flail around, break down, or shut off. We couldn't avoid our vagal response at the party, for example, because we were passing it on to everyone whose paths we crossed. The other guests at the party then mirrored our activated state back to us, keeping us locked and sending us down a path of emotional addiction. Addiction to emotions. When trauma is not addressed appropriately, it is allowed to drive our narratives and define our autonomic responses. Our mind and body become dependent on the intense physical response that results from the release of neurotransmitters connected with that experience and cemented in our brain's neural pathways. In other words, the brain develops a craving for the emotions linked with the trauma response. This is the emotional addiction feedback loop. A typical day in the life of an emotional addict can look like this.